Picture the scene. A scream tears through the frozen silence of a Welsh winter night in January 1457. The cry echoes inside the cold, stone chambers of Pembroke Castle. Outside, the wind howls over jagged cliffs and the sea smashes against the rocks, but inside, all ears are fixed on the fragile voice of a girl too young for what fate has demanded of her. 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort writhes upon blood-stained sheets, her body convulsing in waves of agony that no child should ever endure. Her hair clings damp and tangled across her face, her lips cracked from fever and exhaustion. Around her, midwives move like shadows, their hands swift but trembling, whispering prayers to the Virgin and to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth. The chamber reeks of burning herbs, lavender, rosemary, and bitter rue, meant to ward off death as much as soothe pain. Candles sputter in their iron sconces, throwing grotesque shapes across the walls as the girl's small frame struggles beneath the weight of destiny. This is no ordinary birth. The women present know it. The men waiting beyond the chamber doors know it. In this chamber, amid cries and blood and desperate prayers, England's future teeters on a knife's edge. Margaret is only a child, her hips too narrow, her bones not yet grown. The baby she carries is large, restless, and badly positioned. The physician has already spoken grimly to Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law, warning that both mother and child may not survive the night. Yet the labor continues. There is no stopping it now. Every contraction rings new screams from Margaret's throat, until her voice finally shatters, leaving only hoarse gasps. The midwives know what this means. They have seen too many young girls perish like this, broken by dynastic ambition. They prepare instruments with grim faces, iron hooks, sharp knives, relics to summon heaven's mercy. One midwife murmurs, Deus miseriter, God have mercy. And yet, despite the horror, there is purpose here. Because within Margaret's frail body lies a child whose bloodlines will decide the fate of kingdoms. He will be born Henry Tudor, one day to wear the crown of England as Henry VII, the man who ends the Wars of the Roses and founds a dynasty that changes the course of history. The irony is cruel. That a boy destined to bring peace to England emerges through the near death of a girl barely past childhood. That the mother of kings should be broken in body before she ever reached womanhood. But such was the way of 15th-century politics. Royal blood was both blessing and curse, and Margaret Beaufort had inherited it in abundance. Her veins carried the lineage of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, tying her directly to the royal house of Lancaster. In an England already beginning to tear itself apart, this made her either a prize or a threat, often both. Dynastic blood meant that she could never live an ordinary life. She was not seen as a child, nor even as a woman, but as a vessel, a body meant to secure power through marriage and through heirs. On that freezing night, as Margaret fought for breath between waves of pain, none of this was lost on those around her. Jasper Tudor paced the corridor like a man trapped in purgatory, each muffled scream from within stabbing at his heart. He knew the stakes. His late brother Edmund, Margaret's husband, had left behind only this unborn child. If the boy survived, the Tudor line had a future. If not, their cause perished with him. The midwives worked relentlessly. They burned more herbs, massaged Margaret's belly, tried to shift the child inside her by sheer will. Sweat soaked through the girl's nightgown. Her lips moved in silent prayer. Jesu Maria, she whispered again and again, clinging to her faith as her only anchor. Hours stretched into the long dark of winter's night. Servants carried in basin after basin of steaming water, fresh linens piled high, while Father Meredith, the castle's priest, knelt in the chapel below, chanting psalms until his voice cracked. All of Pembroke seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if life or death would claim the chamber. At last, with a final cry that sounded more like a sob, Margaret's ordeal ended. A slick, pale infant was lifted from her torn body, so still and quiet that the room froze in terror. The midwife Gwenfirk Daffyd worked furiously, clearing his throat, striking his tiny back. For one endless heartbeat, there was nothing, only the crackle of the fire. Then came a wail. Thin, fierce, and alive. Relief swept through the room like a divine wind. The boy was alive. Against all odds, Margaret had given England its heir. Barely conscious, Margaret tried to reach for him. Her body was broken, bloodied, and forever changed, injuries that would ensure she would never bear another child. But in her eyes, half closed with exhaustion, burned the fire of something greater. For a brief moment, the infant was placed upon her chest. She gazed at his tiny face, memorizing every detail, before he was taken to be swaddled and warmed by the fire. That baby was Henry Tudor, and his first cry echoed not just through the walls of Pembroke Castle, but across the history of England. Yet for Margaret, the moment was not triumph, it was survival, bought at unimaginable cost. The girl who had screamed into the night had stepped across the threshold of childhood into a life of relentless sacrifice. And this was only the beginning. To understand how a girl of 13 came to bleed and scream on a birthing bed, one must step back into the shadowed halls of her childhood. Long before Pembroke Castle, Margaret Beaufort's life was marked by whispers of death, betrayal, and politics sharper than any blade. She was born in May of 1443 at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, a child of privilege and peril. Her father was John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a man of royal descent who carried both pride and disgrace in his blood. Through him, Margaret inherited her connection to the Lancastrian line, tracing directly to John of Gaunt, the son of Edward III. It was an inheritance that made her valuable, dangerous, and, ultimately, expendable to the ambitions of others. But John Beaufort himself would not live to secure his daughter's future. When Margaret was only a year old, he returned broken from the battlefields of France. Once entrusted with leading English forces in the final stages of the 100 Years' War, he had instead presided over humiliating losses. Castles fell, lands surrendered, soldiers muttered about poor leadership. The weight of defeat crushed him. By 1444, whispers ran rampant through court. The Duke of Somerset had taken his own life. Others insisted he had been poisoned, yet others muttered fever. The truth was obscured beneath layers of rumor, but what mattered to Margaret's life was this: her father died in disgrace, and she was left fatherless before she could even speak his name. In the violent chessboard of English politics, a child without a father was no more than a pawn, and a dangerous one at that. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, widow and heiress, understood this cruel reality. She wasted no time. For a woman of noble birth, security could be bought only with strategic alliances, and her daughter's bloodline was a powerful bargaining chip. Before the child was old enough to know the meaning of marriage, her future was already being negotiated. At 6 years old, little Margaret Beaufort was betrothed to John de la Pole, heir to the Duke of Suffolk. The union promised strength, an unbreakable tie between two great families. For a brief moment, it looked as though the girl's destiny might be secure. But security in 15th-century England was an illusion that dissolved as quickly as wax before a flame. In 1450, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, fell from grace with shocking violence. Once a trusted advisor to King Henry VI, Suffolk had become the symbol of England's humiliation abroad. He was blamed for the loss of Maine and Anjou to France, concessions that enraged both nobles and commoners. His enemies needed no further excuse. Dragged from his ship while attempting to flee, Suffolk met his end at sea in one of the most brutal executions of the era. Accounts tell of a rusty sword wielded by rough hands, hacking through sinew and bone with clumsy strokes until his head finally fell. His body was tossed into the waves. The sea claimed him, but the spectacle served as a warning to all who had misstepped in the perilous game of politics. For young Margaret, the betrothal contract that had once promised protection now turned to dust. She was unbound again, a child with powerful blood but no shield. The lesson was clear. In England, alliances were as fragile as parchment, and a girl's future could be ripped away in a single night of violence. It was not long before her hand was bargained again. This time, the suitor was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI. The match was politically potent. The Tudors, though Welsh upstarts, held the king's favor, and Edmund himself had been elevated to prominence through royal recognition. By the time Margaret turned 12, the marriage was sealed. The ceremony took place at her childhood home, Bletsoe Castle. Tapestries depicting her Beaufort ancestors lined the hall, as though the dead watched solemnly as the living wove yet another thread of dynastic ambition. Edmund Tudor was a man in his mid-20s, seasoned in politics, hardened by war. Margaret was scarcely more than a child, her body thin and unfinished, her mind still drifting toward games and prayers rather than marriage beds and heirs. Yet there was no thought given to waiting, no pause for her to grow into womanhood. In the eyes of her family, of Edmund, and of England itself, she was ready enough, for her womb was what mattered. The wedding night was not a story Margaret would ever tell, but its aftermath was written into her body, into the trauma that shaped her forever. What should have been a tender passage into maturity was instead a forced initiation into womanhood, orchestrated not for love but for politics. Within months, Margaret's belly began to swell. Those around her rejoiced, but her mother looked on with silent dread. She herself had been 18 when she bore Margaret, strong, full-grown, and barely able to survive. Now she watched her barely 13-year-old daughter face the same ordeal, and fear knotted in her chest. It was a dread that proved prophetic. For before her child could be born, Edmund Tudor, Margaret's husband and protector, was swept into the storm that was gathering across England. The Wars of the Roses had begun. In the autumn of 1456, Edmund was captured during a campaign in Wales. Whether taken in battle, betrayed by his own men, or caught in the snare of politics remains uncertain. What is certain is that weeks later, he was dead. The official word was plague, a convenient explanation, for disease killed many in the squalor of prisons. But the speed of his decline, the refusal of his captors to allow physicians access, whispered of darker truths. Was he poisoned? Quietly murdered to erase a threat to Yorkist power? The truth died with him. Margaret, scarcely 13, was left a widow. Pregnant, alone, and already marked by scandal and politics, she now bore not only her own fate but that of her unborn child. She was vulnerable, but not forgotten. For Edmund's brother, Jasper Tudor, would take her under his protection, knowing the life she carried might yet shape the destiny of England. Thus, the story of the girl-child who became the mother of a king advanced into its next chapter, one marked by danger, exile, and a journey through the frozen roads of Wales. The winter of 1456 pressed its icy fingers across Wales as Margaret Beaufort, barely 13 and heavy with child, was carried toward Pembroke Castle. She was no longer the cherished daughter of a duchess, nor the bride of a nobleman. She was a widow, her husband Edmund Tudor dead in captivity under circumstances so murky they smelled of conspiracy. Whether felled by plague or by a dagger in the dark, Edmund's death left her with only two things: a womb stretched painfully around an unborn heir, and the fragile thread of protection woven by his brother, Jasper Tudor. It was Jasper who took charge of her fate. To him, Margaret was more than a grieving child, she was the vessel of the Lancastrian cause. The Wars of the Roses were spreading like wildfire across the realm, Yorkists and Lancastrians clashing with merciless ferocity, and every drop of royal blood became a weapon. If Margaret's child survived, it could one day rally an entire faction. If it did not, the Tudor line would wither before it even blossomed. The journey from Lampay Palace, where she had been living during Edmund's campaign, to the stone fortress of Pembroke was grueling. The Welsh roads in late autumn were treacherous, muddy, rutted, blocked by swollen rivers. Margaret, already weakened by grief and the strain of pregnancy, was carried in a litter jolting over rocks and frozen ground. Every bump sent pain surging through her small body, every mile deepened her exhaustion. She was scarcely more than a child, her hands clutching rosary beads as her lips muttered endless prayers to the Virgin. The roads were not merely dangerous because of weather. Bands of armed men roamed the countryside, some loyal to York, some to Lancaster, most loyal only to plunder. Jasper's men rode watchful, swords at the ready, for an attack could come from any hedgerow. To lose Margaret, and the child she carried, would be to snuff out the fragile flame of hope for the Tudor cause. At last, Pembroke Castle rose before them. Built on a limestone promontory overlooking the Milford Haven, its great round keep towered 80 feet into the sky. For centuries it had defied sieges and storms, a bastion of survival rather than comfort. It was here, in these bleak and draughty halls, that Margaret would face the most harrowing trial of her life. The castle itself seemed carved from the bones of the earth. Wind shrieked through its arrow slits, the sea's roar was a constant presence. Fires blazed in the great hall, yet the stones themselves seemed to drink the heat, leaving chambers cold and damp. Margaret was lodged in rooms hung with thick tapestries meant to block the draughts, though nothing could keep out the bite of the Atlantic gales. Servants brought her furs and warmed wine, yet her lips still trembled, not only from the cold but from the knowledge that she was utterly alone. Dr. Louis Curlian, a learned physician trained in Oxford and Paris, examined her with growing alarm. He saw what everyone else feared but dared not voice aloud. Margaret's body was not built for childbirth. Her hips were narrow, her bones still soft with youth, and the child within her seemed large, restless. The doctor confided to Jasper in hushed tones that the labor would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. His words hung heavy in the solar, candles sputtering as the two men stared into the fire, each weighed by the knowledge that history might demand the life of a child to bring forth a king. Religion, too, shaped the castle's air. Father Meredith, the resident priest, watched Margaret with sorrow in his eyes. He taught her that gods will often ran through human suffering, that her pain might one day be transformed into glory. Margaret clung to this idea like a lifeline. Day after day she shuffled to the chapel, knees pressed into cold stone, whispering prayers until her skin split and bled. The flickering crucifix above the altar became her silent companion, the only witness to her fears. In those months of waiting, Margaret changed. She was still a girl in years, but the shadow of responsibility hardened her spirit. She began to ask questions, not childish ones, but sharp inquiries about alliances, bloodlines, and loyalty. Jasper, perhaps out of pity or perhaps recognizing her potential, began to answer. He taught her how to read the silences in a noble speech, how to understand the currents beneath politics, how survival depended as much on calculation as on prayer. Even in her fragile state, she absorbed it all, her eyes wide, her mind as hungry as her body was weak. Outside her chamber walls, the storm of civil war gathered strength. In 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans had opened the conflict between York and Lancaster. Since then, blood had been spilled across the realm, and every noble house was forced to choose a side. Margaret knew, whether she wished it or not, that her blood tethered her to Lancaster. To carry Edmund Tudor's child was to carry the hope of a dying cause. And so she waited. She read her Book of Hours by candlelight, tracing prayers with trembling fingers. She listened to the sea battering the cliffs, imagining it was the voice of God reminding her of her smallness. She dreamed of her mother, safe in Bedfordshire, though even that home was no true sanctuary in a country aflame. She was haunted by the memory of Edmund, by the feel of his absence, by the knowledge that the child she bore would never know its father's face. As the winter deepened, the castle seemed to tighten around her. The midwives prepared herbs and linens. The physician rehearsed grim possibilities. Father Meredith polished the crucifix until it gleamed. The servants whispered in corners, fearful not only for their mistress but for the destiny inside her womb. And Margaret herself, frail, exhausted, and terrified, clutched her swelling belly, knowing that the hour was near. She was a widow in a world of wolves, but she carried within her the fragile heartbeat of a child who might, one day, turn predators into prey. The labor pains, when they came, began not with violence but with a slow, gnawing ache in her back as she walked the battlements, trying to take the exercise Dr. Curlian had insisted upon. The ache deepened into a sharp stab, then another, until her knees buckled beneath her. The women rushed to her side, and as they half carried her down the narrow, twisting stairs, Margaret realized with dread that the ordeal had begun. Inside her chamber, herbs were thrown into the fire, prayers were muttered in Latin, and the girl who had once played in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle now braced herself for a trial that would either crown her with triumph or claim her life. The January night in 1457 grew long and merciless inside the walls of Pembroke Castle. Margaret Beaufort's labor began in pain and spiraled into torment that seemed to have no end. What started as sharp stabs in her back became waves of agony that racked her small frame with every contraction. She had scarcely reached her 13th year, her body still soft and narrow-boned, yet she was being torn open by the force of life itself. The midwives, women hardened by decades of ushering children into the world and mothers into graves, exchanged worried glances they did not want their young mistress to see. Dame Gwenfirk Daffyd, the head midwife, had delivered hundreds of infants in Welsh cottages and noble halls alike, but rarely had she faced a trial like this. Margaret's body was not ready, her hips had not yet widened, her bones still carried the fragility of girlhood. It was as if she had been asked to accomplish a miracle against the very laws of nature. The chamber filled with the mingled scents of blood, sweat, and smoldering herbs. Lavender to calm, rosemary for strength, rue to ward away evil. Some women whispered Ave Marias, others muttered ancient charms passed down through generations. A crucifix gleamed faintly in the candlelight, its Christ seeming to bend his head toward the suffering child below. For hour after hour, Margaret screamed until her throat was raw. Then, when her voice failed, only broken gasps remained, the guttural sounds of an animal driven beyond its limits. Servants carried in steaming water, then more, their faces pale with fear. Jasper Tudor paced in the corridor, each muffled cry slicing into him, his boots clattering like a heartbeat of dread. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel below, reciting psalms until his knees bled. At last, Dame Gwen leaned close to Dr. Louis Curlian and whispered what all feared. The child was stuck, Margaret was bleeding, her strength waning. They had to act, or both would perish. Curlian, a physician who had studied Galen and Hippocrates, who had seen kings and peasants alike fall to childbirth's cruelty, looked ashen. He knew what it meant. A manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might kill the mother to save the infant. Yet there was no choice. Saint Margaret of Antioch, guide my hand. Dame Gwen prayed, and then, with practiced yet desperate precision, she reached inside the girl. Margaret arched and cried out, her nails raking at the sheets, her body convulsing as though racked by holy fire. Time seemed to hang suspended, every eye in the chamber fixed on the midwife's bloody hands. Then, with a final wrenching effort, the child was pulled free into the world. For one terrifying instant, silence reigned. The baby was limp, its tiny chest unmoving. Margaret, delirious with pain, turned her glazed eyes toward the infant, and in that stillness it seemed as though death had triumphed. Then Dame Gwen cleared its throat, slapped its back, and a thin, piercing wail filled the chamber. The sound was shrill, furious, alive. Relief crashed over the room. The midwives wept. The physician bowed his head. Margaret, trembling and barely conscious, tried to lift her arms but could not. For a moment, just a moment, the child was placed on her chest, a small, squirming bundle against her bloodied gown. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion, drank in every detail. The soft curve of his cheek, the damp tuft of hair, the living proof that her suffering had not been in vain. Then he was whisked away to the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. The boy would be named Henry Tudor. The child of a dead father and a half-dead mother, he was frail but alive. None present could know that this infant would one day march across Bosworth Field and claim the crown of England. All they knew was that a miracle had been purchased at terrible cost. Margaret's body was shattered. Dr. Curlian examined her and whispered grim words. Tearing, internal injury, blood loss. The damage was permanent. She would never bear another child. Her reproductive life had ended before it had truly begun, sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. The days that followed were a blur of fever and delirium. Infection hovered over her like a vulture. The physician tried everything, bleeding her to balance the humors, poultices of herbs to draw out poison, fortified wines to restore strength. Dame Gwen fed her broth drop by drop between cracked lips, praying constantly at her bedside. Sometimes Margaret muttered the Pater Noster in Latin. Sometimes she screamed into the night as visions of fire and blood swallowed her. When at last she began to recover, it was not without scars deeper than the flesh. The trauma left shadows in her mind. She startled at touches, recoiled from even gentle hands. Nightmares haunted her, pulling her back into the chamber of agony, where she relived the tearing pain, the suffocating terror, again and again. Even the cries of her infant son brought conflicting emotions, love sharpened by fear, devotion poisoned by memory. She wanted him near, yet each time she looked upon his face she remembered the torment that had brought him forth. But if her body was broken, her spirit began to harden. Margaret's suffering became the forge of something greater. As the weeks turned into months and she grew strong enough to walk again, she looked at her son and understood with brutal clarity. He was her purpose. She had been reduced, humiliated, torn apart, but she would not allow it to be meaningless. Henry's survival meant the Tudor name survived, and with it the hope of Lancaster. From her sickbed, she began to pray not only for deliverance but for destiny. She clung to faith with a ferocity that startled those around her, spending hours in chapel, pressing her bruised knees into cold stone. She vowed that her suffering would serve a greater purpose, that her son would not merely live, but reign. Thus, from the blood and tears of a child mother, the future of England was born. By the spring of 1457, Margaret Beaufort was alive, but she was never the same. Her body, torn beyond repair, would never bear another child. Her spirit, however, began to blaze with a strange new clarity. She was no longer a girl to be traded in the marriage market, nor merely a vessel for a man's lineage. She was now the guardian of a single fragile life, the child who might one day turn the tide of a kingdom. But Margaret's survival meant little without protection. England was convulsing with violence, the Wars of the Roses tearing noble houses into shards. Lancaster, the red rose of her bloodline, fought desperately against the white rose of York. Castles changed hands overnight. Families who feasted together one year met on battlefields the next. In such chaos, widows and orphans were little more than prey. It was for this reason that Margaret's family arranged another marriage. She was 14 when she wed Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The ceremony was a quiet affair, lacking the pageantry of her first marriage. No cheering crowds, no feasts worthy of chroniclers. This was not a union of romance but of necessity. Stafford was pragmatic, even cautious, and though he leaned toward the Yorkist side of the conflict, he understood the value of preserving Margaret's vast Beaufort estates. For Margaret, the marriage offered safety for herself and, most importantly, for Henry. Yet safety was a fickle thing. Margaret's world remained defined by war. In 1461, she witnessed from the sidelines as one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil engulfed the north. Towton, Palm Sunday, fought on snow-slicked ground in Yorkshire. Contemporary accounts spoke of a field drowned in red, of 30, perhaps 40,000 men left dead. Crows feasted for weeks. Families waited for fathers, brothers, and sons who never returned. The smell of rot clung to the land like a curse. Towton was a Yorkist victory, and with it Edward IV, a tall, charismatic warrior, seized the throne from Henry VI. The Lancastrian king, weak, prone to fits of madness, unable to rule, was cast aside. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, fled to France with her young son. The red rose seemed crushed beneath the white. For Margaret Beaufort, the outcome was devastating. Her own Lancastrian blood marked her as suspect under the new Yorkist regime. Worse still, her child Henry, though only a boy, carried a blood claim that Yorkist kings could not ignore. To them, he was not a child but a threat, a banner around which future rebellion could gather. And so Henry remained in Wales, under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor, living almost as a stranger to his mother. Margaret saw her son only rarely, perhaps once or twice a year, and then only with permission. The separation was agony. She wrote him letters coded in careful phrases, disguised as innocent notes about family matters. She sent books, small gifts, tokens that might remind him of the mother he scarcely knew. Yet she lived in constant terror that one day word would come, the boy was dead, smothered by assassins or slain in battle. Margaret herself learned to survive in the Yorkist world by weaving a web of quiet alliances. Unlike men, who fought their battles with steel and blood, women of her rank fought with parchment, whispers and smiles. She exchanged letters with Elizabeth Woodville, the beautiful and ambitious queen of Edward IV. She kept secret communications alive with Margaret of Anjou, still plotting in exile. These relationships were dangerous, requiring her to walk a razor's edge. A single misplaced phrase could mean imprisonment, even death. Yet through it all, she sharpened her skills, discretion, negotiation, the art of appearing harmless while plotting with deadly purpose. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, was not blind to her Lancastrian sympathies, yet he valued his estates more than his king. Wounded at the Battle of Edgecote in 1469, Stafford returned embittered by the cause he had bled for. He listened more closely when Margaret murmured doubts about Yorkist justice, about Edward IV's gratitude. Slowly, she planted seeds that shifted him closer to her own loyalties, though she was too shrewd to push openly. Still, history gave her little time to maneuver. In 1470, the political kaleidoscope shifted again. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, turned against Edward IV and, astonishingly, allied with Margaret of Anjou. Together, they restored Henry VI to the throne, staggering and bewildered from his imprisonment. Margaret must have watched with pounding heart as the red rose lifted its head once more. Was this the moment her son could return? Was the tide of fortune turning? For months she lived on that knife edge of hope. But it was a fragile miracle. In 1471, Edward IV returned with an army of hardened Burgundian mercenaries. At Barnet, Warwick was slain. At Tewkesbury, Margaret of Anjou's only son, Edward of Westminster, was butchered in the aftermath of battle. Henry VI himself disappeared into the Tower of London, where he soon died. Whether by neglect or by Richard of Gloucester's dagger, none could say. With those deaths, the Lancastrian cause lay in ruins. And suddenly, chillingly, all eyes turned toward one boy. Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, only 14, was now the last living male heir of the House of Lancaster. The danger was immediate. Jasper Tudor, knowing capture meant execution, made a desperate decision. He gathered Henry and fled Wales, slipping onto a ship bound for Brittany. Storms battered them as they crossed the Channel, Yorkist patrols hunted them, but by some providence they landed safely on foreign soil. When word reached Margaret that her son had fled into exile, her world collapsed. She had endured years of separation, years of waiting and hoping. Now Henry was across the sea, farther from her than ever, his life balanced on the whims of foreign dukes. She did not know if she would ever see him again. Yet grief did not destroy her. It transmuted into something colder, harder, ambition forged in fire. If she could not cradle her son, she would crown him. If she could not protect him as a mother, she would shield him as a strategist. Margaret Beaufort became more than a mother. She became the mother of a cause. The year 1471 left Margaret Beaufort hollowed by grief and yet tempered by steel. Her only child, Henry Tudor, had vanished into the mists of exile, a 14-year-old boy torn from his homeland and cast upon the mercy of foreign courts. She, meanwhile, remained in England, 30 years old, twice widowed, and surrounded by enemies who viewed her very bloodline as treason. But Margaret did not collapse beneath the weight of loss. She transmuted grief into strategy. If she could not be a mother in the nursery, she would be a mother in the shadows, a woman who would scheme, endure, and ultimately deliver her son to the throne. Her third marriage was the keystone of this transformation. She chose not the safety of obscurity but the perilous power of alliance. In 1472 she wed Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, a man whose very name was synonymous with political survival. Stanley had mastered the art of hesitation. He joined battles late, pledged loyalty cautiously, and always contrived to stand with the victor when the dust settled. For decades he had navigated the Wars of the Roses without ruin, a feat that itself was legendary. To others, Stanley seemed fickle, self-serving, untrustworthy. To Margaret, he was the perfect partner. With Stanley, she gained access to a vast network of retainers, soldiers, and spies. With him, she gained legitimacy at Edward IV's court, a cover beneath which she could quietly pursue her own ambitions. Their marriage was not romantic, but it was ruthlessly effective. From this vantage, Margaret began weaving an invisible net across England. She cultivated contacts in noble households, merchant guilds, even monasteries. Her letters were masterpieces of subtlety, often cloaked in religious language or mundane references, yet carrying coded instructions that passed safely through Yorkist hands. Through this web, she learned of troop movements, shifting loyalties, and whispers from foreign courts. If Edward IV sneezed, Margaret knew about it before many of his counselors. Yet her thoughts were never far from Brittany, where Henry Tudor lived under the wary protection of Duke Francis II. The boy grew into a young man there, schooled in languages, diplomacy, and swordplay, though always shadowed by the knowledge that he was valuable only as a bargaining chip. Margaret maintained their fragile connection through letters written in invisible ink, messages folded into seemingly innocent correspondence about cloth shipments or pilgrimage offerings. At night she prayed until her knees bruised, not merely for Henry's safety but for his triumph. Then, in 1483, the fragile balance shattered again. Edward IV, still in the prime of his years, died suddenly, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. For a moment, it seemed England might see stability under a boy king guided by a regency council. But that hope was extinguished by Edward's own uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard seized the crown with ruthless speed. The boy king and his younger brother were lodged in the Tower of London and never seen alive again. The whispers spread like wildfire. The princes had been murdered, smothered in their sleep, by command of their uncle. Whether true or not, the stain was indelible. Richard III was crowned king, but his legitimacy was crippled from the start. For Margaret Beaufort, Richard's usurpation was not a disaster but an opportunity. With Yorkist blood tainted by infamy, her son's distant Lancastrian claim began to shine with new luster. In Henry, disaffected nobles saw not merely a rebel, but a savior, a king unsullied by fratricide, a chance for unity. Margaret seized this chance with both hands. Through the cunning Bishop John Morton, she began to coordinate rebellion. She promised alliances, arranged financing, and even opened clandestine talks with Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen of Edward IV. The two women, once enemies, now conspired to unite their causes. They hatched a plan so audacious it seemed born of desperation. Henry Tudor would invade England, claim the crown, and marry Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting red, rose and white in a single, indissoluble bond. The rebellion of 1483 failed. Betrayals exposed the plot, Richard's men crushed uprisings, and Margaret herself was placed under house arrest. Yet even then, she did not yield. Stripped of titles, confined within her husband's household, she continued her work. Servants carried her letters. Priests whispered her messages under the guise of prayer. Every setback only deepened her resolve. For 2 more years, Margaret waited, plotted, endured. And then, in 1485, her moment came. Henry, now a man of 27, landed at Milford Haven with a small but determined army. His banner bore the red dragon of Cadwallader, symbol of Welsh prophecy. Word spread like wildfire. The exile had returned to claim his birthright. At Bosworth Field, August 22, 1485, destiny was decided. Richard III charged into battle with the fury of a cornered lion. Henry stood vulnerable, his claim fragile, his army outnumbered. All hung upon a single choice. The Stanleys, Margaret's husband and his brother, waited on the sidelines with thousands of men. Would they side with Richard or Henry? At the decisive moment, the Stanleys moved. They turned their swords not against Henry, but against Richard. Betrayed, encircled, the last Plantagenet king fell in the mud, his crown seized and placed upon Henry's head. Margaret Beaufort's decades of endurance, suffering, and relentless scheming had borne fruit. Her son was now Henry VII, King of England. She emerged from the shadows as the most powerful woman in the realm. She styled herself not merely as Dowager Countess of Richmond, but as My Lady the King's Mother. Her influence over her son was profound, her counsel trusted above all others. Yet though she lived to see her son secure the Tudor dynasty, marry Elizabeth of York, and father the children who would shape England's future, she never fully reclaimed the ordinary joys of motherhood. The boy she had birthed in agony had become a king, but he was never simply hers. In 1509, Margaret died just days after her grandson, Henry VIII, ascended the throne. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, her tomb inscribed with words of reverence. Yet stone cannot capture the truth. Her legacy was carved not only in marble, but in the flesh and blood she had sacrificed, in the scream of a 13-year-old girl torn open by destiny, in the iron will that turned maternal love into political gold. Margaret Beaufort was no mere mother. She was the architect of a dynasty, the woman who ended the Wars of the Roses, the child bride who endured torment so that her son might one day wear a crown. And though history remembers her as pious, calculating, formidable, one must never forget the sound that began it all. The agonized cry of a girl on a storm-lashed night in Wales, giving birth to the future of England.